Today we're going to talk about, it's a general thing on the Caribbean islands. It's kind of a physical, cultural introduction, very brief, and then a little bit of the political history of the islands, because some of it's pretty fascinating and seemingly, looking from afar, kind of ridiculous. And then I will, in my next talk, be talking, it's called the Sweet Caribbean, and it will be about the role of sugarcane and how that made the Caribbean what it is today. Because particularly for the non-Spanish speaking islands, but later on, even for them, sugarcane is the story of the Caribbean islands and the slavery that came with it. Because they would be nothing like they are today if that hadn't happened. So that's what the next talk will be about. Today is just a more general, trying to make some sense, because there are a lot of islands out there. How many islands are there in the Caribbean? Anybody know? No? I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. Okay, so here is just this is a 5th grade map. I put this map up because the colors show you exactly the different islands, although the little ones aren't big enough to show up here. What I'm going to do, start off, is try and make some sense for you out of these islands, group them together a bit. So we're going to start off with the big ones. There are 4, and by the way, that's where we're going, Jamaica. So down there from Panama to Jamaica, it's a day-and-a-half haul, and we'll be at sea again tomorrow. By the way, did any of you look at the boobies this afternoon? One person did. That's it. They were all over. They are the most fun birds in the world to watch. There were all kinds of brown boobies out there. And these aren't as much fun as some of the other ones. The masked boobies and the blue-footed boobies fly higher, and then when they spy some fish, one of them will shriek, and then they just all dive. These guys fly closer to the water, and they'll kind of quack, but I didn't hear any shrieks. Anyway, there were a lot of them out there. They're fun to watch. So we're going to look first at the big islands. Up north, there are 4, what we call Greater Antilles, and that's Cuba. That's Hispaniola, which has 2 countries, Haiti, Dominican Republic. There's Puerto Rico, and there's Jamaica, where we're going, all right? And I'm going to talk less about them than about some of the other islands, but I will talk about them a bit as well. And then these are the Lesser Antilles, this great arc of islands here. And then we got other islands that aren't part of the Lesser Antilles. Over there in the far left, you see something called the Netherlands Antilles. They're not called that anymore, so this is an old map. Netherlands Antilles as a grouping by the Netherlands, that term doesn't exist. So Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire are those 3 islands. And then over just at the bottom on the right-hand side, we've got Trinidad and Tobago, which aren't considered part of the Lesser Antilles. They're actually continental islands. In other words, the geology there is connected with the geology of that part of South America. So you can see Trinidad is barely off the coast of Venezuela. So the rest of it then is part of what we call the Lesser Antilles. Now, there is the stuff that is not part of inside the red, the stuff outside of it, forms this big arc that is virtually all volcanic islands. All of those are comprised of volcanic materials mostly, and some active ones as well, which you may know about if you've read about that, but I'll talk more about that in a second. And then the ones on the right are ones that may have old volcanics in them, but they're not places that there's any threat of volcanic activity. They are less mountainous. They have some more substantial areas of relatively flat terrain, and when sugarcane came along, they were the first to get going. Barbados, Antigua, it's Antigua, they call it, etc. It's Antigua in Guatemala, it's Antigua on this island. So we also have what I call the mainland islands. Belize, where we've been, Guyana, Suriname. French Guiana is still part of France, so it's not an independent country, but both Guyana and Suriname are. But their histories are very similar to those of the Caribbean islands, and in fact, the Dutch and the Brits were messing around in Guyana and Suriname before they really got going in the rest of the Caribbean at the end of the 16th century, early 17th century. So here's some physical characteristics of the non-Spanish speaking. In other words, we're not talking about Hispaniola, Cuba, or Puerto Rico. So, and much of this is true of them as well, but they're all tropical. They're all places that don't get freezes unless you're at the highest elevations, although in the Lesser Antilles, the highest peaks don't reach 5,000 feet. The highest peak in the total Caribbean is in the Dominican Republic, and it's a bit over 10,000 feet. In Cuba, the highest mountain is a bit over 8,000 feet. So the mountains are substantial. A lot of the islands are virtually entirely mountainous, but they're not the Sierra Nevada or the Rockies or the Himalaya. And the volcanic nature, I already pointed that out, of some of these. In the 1990s, the island that blew up all over the place, Montserrat, which is a British overseas territory, still is, half the people had to leave the island because the volcano blew up and ash falling all over the island, and it stayed active into the new millennium. It's quieted down a lot now. Some folks have gone back, but a real disaster. And then this last year, St. Vincent in October, November, at the southern end of the Lesser Antilles, started blowing up and scaring people, and people had to move because they didn't know exactly what was going to happen, and it's quieted down some as well. But if we go back to the early 20th century, on St. Vincent and on Martinique, a couple of volcanoes blew up and killed thousands of people. So volcanism is a real deal in the Lesser Antilles, and one that can be a real threat. Hurricanes, I don't think I need to talk about. You all read the papers, or nobody reads the papers anymore except me, but you all look at your whatever device you have, and you see that hurricanes are going on, or on the television, you see that. Hurricanes are a real deal. Boy, I can never remember these names. I think it was Irma in 2017 or 2018. That's the one that really messed up Puerto Rico. Before it hit Puerto Rico, it hit some of the Lesser Antilles, most especially Dominica, which is one of the lightly populated islands, and one that is less developed than most of them, and just obliterated stuff. I was there on a cruise less than a year later, and boy, it was, I mean, they were still south of the capital, which isn't a very big town. They were still stringing wire, connecting places back up. So hurricanes, a real threat here. And then just to give you an idea of volcanism, I'm standing on the island of St. Kitts in the northern part of the Lesser Antilles, and we're looking across which St. Kitts is, along with neighboring island Nevis, is an independent nation. We're looking across at St. Eustatius, which is still connected to the Netherlands. And you can see, I'm just trying to give you an idea of the volcanism there. Not all of the volcanic areas are nice and pyramidal like that, but that one is. And by the way, remember St. Eustatius, because I'm going to come back with some, I think, interesting information on this little island in a couple of minutes. So remember St. Eustatius. Here is St. Lucia. These two places are pretty famous. They're in all the advertisements. Come visit St. Lucia and see Le Piton. The highest point there, 2,619 feet. So it's not, it's not hugely tall, but it comes right out of the ocean. And these are what we call volcanic necks or volcanic plugs. These were the centers of volcanoes where magma was spurting out, lava was spurting out molten material, and then the volcano cooled, and this stuff hardened within the volcanic vent. The stuff around it was mostly ash and so forth, and eventually eroded over thousands of years, but the magma was more resistant stuff, the solidified magma, and so that's what you've got left. These were surrounded by bigger volcanoes. Here is Central Grenada. You wouldn't know that this is necessarily volcanic, but it is. There are several volcanoes, pieces of ones there. The same is true on Dominica. It's just volcanism all over. A lot of that produces some fairly fertile soil, so where you can plant stuff on these islands, it can grow pretty well. But there are, especially in the smaller islands, there are limited areas on most of them for practicing agriculture. All right, some cultural characteristics. Again, the non-Spanish speaking islands. So African bloodlines are dominant here. I think you know that. On many of these islands, you're looking at 90+% of the population descended from folks who came from Africa. Obviously, there are some mixtures. There are folks from Europe, and there is more. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. There is more ethnic variety in the Caribbean than you might suspect, because there were some interesting immigrants that came over in the second half of the 19th century and on into the 20th century. But the colonial period is the history here, because before the colonial period, all the people that were in these islands were wiped out, almost all of them. There are still a few Carib indigenous folk on Dominica, a few in St. Vincent, maybe a few in Trinidad, but essentially wiped out. All of the Taino or Arawak folks were wiped out, as were the Siboney. So there really isn't any history there, although we find some cultural relics from the Taino in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. The other interesting thing to me is that the broadest sense of ID of these folks isn't we are Caribbean islands, or we are English-speaking Caribbean islands, or we are French-speaking or Dutch-speaking Caribbean islands. It is we are Barbadians, we are St. Vincents, we are Arubans, and that's the end of our identity. We don't think together on all of this. And I have a couple of examples here. St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla, when the colonial movement, the independence movement was going on in the 1970s, and Britain was trying to get as many of these islands to be independent countries as possible, and it wanted to group them where it could, because Anguilla at the time had 6,000 people. How is it going to make it as an independent country? And so it said, I want you to group together with St. Kitts and Nevis, which are right next to one another. You can see one from the other. Anguilla is a bit farther away. And the Anguillans said, no way. Those people will dominate us. We don't want anything to do with them as being part of a country. We want to stay with you, Great Britain, United Kingdom. And the British said, I don't think so. So they sent over some troops, some planes with troops to take control of Anguilla. The Anguillans put oil drums out all over the runway so the planes couldn't land. So Britain had to send in paratroopers to take over this island of 6,000 people. And it remains a British overseas territory. It is not independent. It is not part of the country of St. Kitts and Nevis. Also, the United Kingdom tried to create a West Indian Federation in 1968, I think it was, and to group these islands together so that Trinidad and Jamaica, some of the smaller islands, so they all didn't produce the same thing, because that's what happens really is they're primarily agricultural, or now they're primarily tourist, and so by producing the same things and in need of all kinds of other things, they're depending on the outside world. So let's get our act together. Let's start to produce some things locally. You can make these in Trinidad. You can make these in Barbados and so forth. That lasted 3 years. And, one island would say, well, no, you're taking advantage of us. And the other one says, oh, no, they're taking advantage of us. And it didn't last. So I say all that to show you the individual identity that folks in the Caribbean carry with them. And because of the size, then, few of the needs, not to mention the wants, few of the needs on these islands are available there. most stuff is imported. And what's kind of sad in a way is particularly foodstuffs, because there are foodstuffs, the traditional foodstuffs that were there before the Europeans arrived. If they concentrated on those, a lot more people could be fed, and you wouldn't be spending money on imports. But you know, with U.S. advertising, or with British advertising, or with French advertising, stuff gets brought in cans and packages, and they pay a lot more money, and it's a sad way that that's turned out. All right, who was here when the Spanish arrived? Because they were the first, obviously, from Europe. And way out on the western ends of Haiti and Cuba, we had people called the Siboney. And the Siboney were pre-agricultural peoples. They hunted, gathered fish, but they hadn't advanced enough to know how to plant crops or to take care of domestic animals, to take care of any animals. So they were, I don't like to use that word, but they were what we would call the most primitive people among the islands. But there weren't very many of them. And then along came, and they undoubtedly displaced the Siboney as they moved into the Caribbean. We had what we used to call Arawak people. Arawak is still a language group with various languages within it, but we now call these people, in most places we call them Taino. And the Taino, about 1,500 years ago, began to move in from the Amazon up into to Venezuela, down the Orinoco, and in their canoes began to occupy island by island in the Caribbean, and occupied all of the Lesser Antilles and all of the Greater Antilles. So over that 1,500 years, they marched a long way. Then, about 100 years before the Spanish showed up, in other words, around 1400, another group from the same area called the Caribs began the same pathway into the Caribbean. But the Caribs were tougher folks. They were more militant, and they relatively easily defeated the Taino when it came to, we want your island. The Taino weren't able to defend themselves, and so the Caribs, just as the Taino had, marched island by island. As I mentioned in the talk on the Garifuna, if you happen to have been here for that, however, mostly they took into slavery or killed the males, kept the females, and so the Taino language was preserved because the females raised their children speaking the Taino language, which is the way the Garifuna ended up speaking still today, a Taino language. The Caribs got as far as the last of the Lesser Antilles when the Spanish arrived. They were knocking on the door in Puerto Rico, the most eastern of the Greater Antilles. They were starting to raid there. The Spanish show up, and that's the end of that game. So the Greater Antilles were still occupied by the Taino and a few Siboney. The Lesser Antilles were all occupied, if they were occupied, some islands weren't, were all occupied by Carib folks. And the Spanish, this is jumping ahead a little bit of our political thing, the Spanish didn't do much with the Lesser Antilles because they were occupied by Caribs, and they found out when they went into battle with these guys, they were pretty tough. And there didn't seem to be any gold there anyway. So that's why those islands were all kind of available to these interlopers that came along in the 17th century from other European countries. The Spanish had just more or less left them alone. So here are our principal actors in the European period. There are a couple others I'm going to mention too that may surprise you, but the Spanish, British, French, Dutch, I'm sure you know that they were all there. They all possessed some islands, and they all, other than the Spanish, still have some islands in the Caribbean. Now, there are interesting stories, some of these islands. How many of you have been to St. Martin? A few of you, right? I don't know if you remember the brochures that are out. You know, they always put out things that make the island that you're going to sound like the most wonderful place in the world, and sometimes it is. But in the case of St. Martin to this day, and from its colonial beginning, has a southern part that is still connected with the Netherlands and a northern part that is still connected with France. And so the literature you read is that, well, we arrived here, we French and we Dutch, in the 17th century, and there were some disputes and so forth. But in 1648, we got together, some guys walked along the island, and they divided it into this French and this Dutch portion, and it's remained that way since 1648. And I'm not drunk, by the way. The ship is just going like that, so I don't drink till after the talk. Any of you remember reading that literature that it's been like that since 1648? Probably wouldn't remember. Okay, well, that's the case. I mean, you could go online when you're done here and look it up, and you'll say, oh, gee, it's been French and Dutch just like that since 1648. Is that the truth? No, because this is what's happened since 1648. Never put this much text on a slide unless you want your audience to leave. But I put it on here to make a point that this island went back and forth between people like you can't believe during its colonial history. So, just to take advantage of you, in 1633, 1647, the Spanish saw these guys were there, and they said, we don't want anybody else here. This has been Spanish territory all this time. So they built a fort there and took over, and then suddenly they left in 1647. Nobody seems to be sure why, but they just abandoned the island, and so that's when it was divided. But after that, the French occupy the entire island. Then the English say, well, we don't want to be left out. They occupy the entire island. Then the French, then the Dutch, then the French, then the British, then the Dutch, then the French, then the British. And then in 1810, it's the next, along with Holland, by France, part of Napoleon's fun and games. And then the British say, well, we're going to come back one more time at least. So they come back for 6 years. And then finally, in 1816, those French and Dutch zones are reestablished. So that literature should read ever since 1816, which I think that's still an accomplishment, right? That's over 200 years. I'd be proud of that. But no, they got to make it almost 400 years. So truth isn't always what is put before you. And this, while all the islands, the Lesser Antilles, didn't go through this, many of them went through something similar. And remember St. Eustatius? I asked you to remember that island, that volcanic-shaped island I showed you. St. Eustatius is still a Dutch-connected island, and it's all of 8 square miles, all right, not very big. 3,138 people last count. It could be a couple more than that or a couple less than that today, but that's what it was last time they counted it. What about St. Eustatius? Well, from 1764, and it's a typo here, it should be 1774, for 10 years, it changed hands 10 times. Why would a little island like that change hands that many times? Well, St. Eustatius sat right in the middle of French, British, Spanish, and we haven't mentioned them yet, Danish interests. And the Dutch were very clever traders, and we'll talk about them in my following talk on sugarcane, but they were very clever. They charged no duties to goods coming in or going out of their port. So this little island had blocks-long warehouses on it where all these different folks would come in and illegally trade, because the British were supposed to be just buying and selling in their own ships, and so were the French. And the St. Eustatians, hey, come on in, folks, no duties here. You have to pay for warehousing space, but no customs duties. And so it was really active, and as a matter of fact, it's felt that it was a major supplier of armaments to the Americans in our War of Revolution against the British. And the British hated St. Eustatius because here were the rebels acquiring all these arms. And finally, St. Eustatius was the first political entity that recognized the United States. The United States ship was coming in 1776. I can't remember the date, but it was after the Revolutionary War was done, coming in, and they fired a cannon saluting the ship, saying, "We recognize you, United States." So that's the first place. There's a nice little fact. Next time you need to up somebody that is trying to dominate you, you say, "Okay, Fred." Is anybody named Fred? I don't mean to. Let's just say, "Okay, Bill." What was the first political entity to recognize the independence of the United States? And Bill's not going to know, okay? So you can credit me with that. Thank you. This I've already told you. So St. Lucia, let's look at St. Lucia. St. Lucia is the island with the Les Pitons, the volcanic plugs that I told you about, showed you a slide of. The French established a treaty with the Caribs in 1660. You'll notice that these islands down in the southern part of the Lesser Antilles get occupied later. Again, they're occupied by Caribs. The British and French even don't know quite what to do with them. Britain comes in 1663, and then after that, Britain and the French change ownership here 14 times. So this story just gets repeated in island after island. It finally became British from 1814, and then 1979 becomes independent. St. Vincent, which is just to the south of St. Lucia, very similar history. British claim it 1627. This is where the Garifuna come from. French settlement began, I can't find an exact date, but just before 1700. And then you can see the rest of it from there. I've often thought St. Vincent became independent along with a bunch of smaller islands called the Grenadines. And when I was in high school, we had all these bands with somebody and Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps and so on and so forth. I often thought I should have started a rock and roll band and called it St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's just a perfect name for a rock and roll band. And maybe I'll still do that if I could learn to play an instrument, but not too likely. So you get the feeling then there was a lot of stuff going on in terms of who's running what island. The settlers didn't necessarily, if it became French and British had been settling it, the British settlers didn't necessarily leave, and vice versa. So the settlers might stay the same. So we have a situation even today in St. Vincent and St. Lucia and Dominica, which ended up in the end being British colonies, where there are still people, especially in the interior, in more remote parts of the islands, that still speak a French patois, because the French had imposed their culture more than the British had over those colonial years. And I had an interesting conversation with a worker on a cruise ship several years ago who was from Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, which also was run by the French. And so I said, "Hey, the folks on Dominica, I ran into a guy from there who spoke a French patois." He said, "Yeah, I can understand him. We can speak in patois, and we understand one another." And even with the folks in Haiti, the same thing. So I find that pretty interesting, that far away, that they could communicate in a language that, in the case of Dominica, not the present dominant language of the country, or not the present official language of the country. So those of you who want to practice your French in some of these islands, go into the interior, and you may find somebody. The other interesting part of that is that a lot of these changes of ownership happened because of battles that were going on in Europe. The battles weren't necessarily on the islands themselves, although there might be a British ship or two, or a French ship or two, or a Dutch ship or two out here involved in firing a few cannons. But usually it was something going on in Europe, and of course when Napoleon was running around beating everybody up, a lot of things were going on in the Caribbean, and including Haiti becoming independent, just for example. So the number of treaties, the number of battles would make you think that island fights were going on all the time, but most of it was centered in activity in Europe, and so Britain would say, all right, well, we'll retreat our forces from someplace in Europe, and the French would say, all right, how about you give us 2 islands for 1 island out there in the Caribbean? And that's how that kind of stuff worked. Some of those changes just were negotiations that really involved what was going on in Europe. And this is just a partial list of some of the treaties where Caribbean stuff was involved. There's a whole long list, but this will just give you an indication of some of the possibilities. You can see there's more than one called the Treaty of Paris. In fact, there is one more other than the 2 I've listed here. So, who else was here? Well, we got the Virgin Islands out there, and I think most of you who are from the United States know that we have the U.S. Virgin Islands. They are the ones to the left and below that dotted red line, and the 3 main ones are St. Thomas, St. John, and farther down, St. Croix. Those are the American Virgin Islands, and they're still essentially colonies of the United States. Above that line and to the right are the British Virgin Islands, and they are still British overseas territories. They're still connected to Britain. But the first folks on the British Virgin Islands were actually the Dutch. You can see the top island there on the left, Jost van Dyke. Doesn't sound very British, does it? And he was the first European, I should say, to occupy a part of that island, and then other Dutch came along, but about 1672, the British came along and said, we're taking control. In the case of the American Virgin Islands, they were owned not all at the same point, but beginning in the 18th century, the Danes came along. They were looking for, the Danes were involved in plantation agriculture and slavery like the rest of these folks, and they managed to acquire these islands, these 3, St. Croix, they bought from the French, and so the Danes were colonial occupiers in the Caribbean for a couple of hundred years. What happens is that eventually they weren't making any money there, and they were trying to offload them, and they weren't having much luck. World War I comes along, and the U.S. decides that, it would be good to have some naval locations in the Caribbean, and so in 1917, we bought the Danish Virgin Islands, and those are now the American Virgin Islands. So even the Danes were practicing sugarcane production in the Caribbean. And they aren't the last ones I'm going to mention. If they surprise you, how about these guys? Anybody heard of the Knights Hospitaller, also called the Knights of Malta? These guys started during the Crusades in Jerusalem, moved to different places for different reasons. I don't have time to go into their whole history, but they end up on Malta in the 16th century and are there for quite a while. Today, they still exist. They're headquartered in Rome today, but the Knights they were from around Europe, but mainly they were like the 2nd or 3rd sons of wealthy families, and most especially from France. So they had some good connections, political connections in Europe, and again, especially in France. And so the French colonies at this point were not being run by the French government, but they were being run by a French company, much the way the Dutch and the English operated in some of their colonial territories as well. And this company was in trouble. And the head of the Hospitaller Knights knew the head of this company in France. And the guy said, hey, you guys are good at organizations. The Knights actually became a fierce military power for a while, believe it or not, in the Caribbean, occupying Malta, fended off the Turks. The rest of Europe thanked them forever for that. Anyway, said, why don't you guys are good at organization, why don't you run these islands for us over there? You can be the colonial power. So they did. For 14 years, they took possession of these 5 islands. At that time, St. Christophe, which today we call St. Kitts, part of it was British, part of it, the red parts that you see on there, were French. The white stripe in the middle was English. And then the others were French islands. St. Martin, of course, part of it was Dutch. And so we had a colonial, quote-unquote, power there you probably didn't realize was there. But they soon realized that wasn't their game. So what I'm going to do now is show you what's happened to these islands, because many of them are independent countries, but not all of them are. So we're going to start with the French islands. And the two major French islands in the Caribbean are Guadeloupe and Martinique. And these are to France kind of the way Hawaii is to the U.S. If you are in Martinique or you are in Guadeloupe, you are in France. Just like if you're in Hawaii, you're in the United States. France has interesting political structure. Many of you may know that France basically is divided into departments, what we might call states, except their departments are much smaller. They're more the size of counties in a lot of our states. There are 101 departments in France today. That number changes from time to time because the French are flexible about politics. All right, let's not get too tight about how we do things. So they decided also, they've had these regions, and it's very hard to follow. I lived in France for a year, and I came out still not understanding it. But in 2014, they created a situation with 18 regions. 5 of those regions are overseas regions. 2 of those 5 are Martinique and Guadeloupe. So among the 18 regions, 2 of them are in the Caribbean, and they vote in the French Parliament. They vote for European Union stuff. They are just citizens of France, out of Europe, obviously, and the currency there is the euro. So the next slide I'm going to show you doesn't show Martinique because there's nothing south of Martinique that has anything to do with France. So here we've got Guadeloupe. These islands right near it there, the 3 just to the east and south, those are all run by Guadeloupe. They're all part of Guadeloupe. But the 2 up there, St. Bart's is how we usually call it, St. Barthélemy, and St. Martin, the northern part of St. Martin, they in 2007 said, we don't want to be part of Guadeloupe. It's the same thing with Anguilla and St. Kitts and Nevis. They said, those are the big boys over there, and they take advantage of it. We don't want. So France said, all right, well, you can be ruled directly from France, what the French call overseas collectivities, basically municipal units. And so they are ruled directly from France, and they are connected with France, and they can vote in the parliament and so on as well. It's interesting how some of these island folks would rather be ruled from thousands of miles away than 100 miles away or less than that, because they are jealous. It's that island individuality that I was mentioning earlier, and we'll see they aren't the only ones. So the Dutch have 2 collections of islands. Up north, they have these 3. St. Martin, the southern part of it, remember the northern part is French. St. Eustatius, and you can see S-I-N-T, means saint in Dutch. And then Saba, one we did mention. So those 3 islands are part of the Netherlands, and then, and just the southern part of St. Martin. And then over here, we have Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire, which are also part of the Netherlands. Just to give you an idea, here is, not all the islands are in there, but that's about where the other 3 islands I just showed are located. Now, it ain't that simple, folks. This is the most complicated political arrangement I can think of. So, we have something called the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Kingdom of the Netherlands. Within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, there are 4 constituent countries. One of them is, guess what? The Netherlands. All right, makes sense. One of them is Aruba. Became independent in 1986, but it's a constituent country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Another is Curacao, and the other is the Dutch part of St. Martin. So those are the 4 constituent countries within the Netherlands. Now, clearly, those 3 Caribbean units they can't operate effectively without help from the kingdom. That's pretty clear. But in fact, they have some independent operational capabilities in terms of the world stage as independent units. Now, what about the other 3? What about Bonaire, Saba, and St. Eustatius? They are, in effect, municipalities, much the way that the rest of St. Martin is with France, or St. Bart's is with France. That's how they are with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So they would rather be part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands than connected with their other Dutch islands out in the Caribbean. So Bonaire, which only has 14,000 people, it's right there by Aruba and Curacao. You'd think it would want to have something to do with it, but no. We want to be ruled from the mother country over there. It's really, to me, strange politics. So that's how the French and the Dutch islands are working. What we've got now in terms of independent countries in the Caribbean, many of these you know, particularly on the left-hand side, you know those are all independent countries. But then some of them maybe you don't know as independent countries. But it turns out there are quite a few in the Caribbean, huh? And probably more than you would have thought. And you wonder how some of them actually get along, because some of these have less than 100,000 people as a country. And most of the smaller ones, and obviously not Cuba or the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica has, I don't know, 2.2 to 2.5 million people, and it gets a lot smaller after that. And then those that are associated with somebody else, the British have the Cayman Islands, which I talked about before, nothing there, so don't worry about it. The British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands, which are southeast of the Bahamas, Anguilla, and Montserrat. The Dutch associated ones, I've already gone over. French associated, U.S. associated I didn't mention, but those of you who are from the U.S. probably know that. So that's the situation in the Caribbean politically. A lot of independent countries, but a lot of islands still connected with a mother country. Thank you all very much for coming today. And I will be giving, tomorrow's a sea day, then we're in Jamaica for a day. Then we have 2 sea days. So the last 2 sea days, I'll be giving a talk each day. The first one will be on that whole sugarcane episode, slavery episode in the Caribbean. And the last one will be on bananas, which may sound like a strange subject, but it's kind of a fun topic, actually, and you might learn something. So I hope you'll come to both of those. Thanks for coming, and in your dinner time, I'm greatly impressed. Thanks a lot.